So if you could briefly introduce yourself, tell me who you are and what you do.
My name is Jennifer Miller-Smith. I chair the Disability Caucus for the Utah Democratic State Party, the Salt Lake County Democratic Party. I'm a member of DRAC and Legislative Coalition for People with Disabilities.
Thank you. So for our interview today, I'll be asking a series of questions about your experience with disability activism in Utah. We have an hour for the interview, so feel free to share any stories in as much detail as you can remember them. And first off, how long have you been involved in disability rights in Utah?
4.5 years ago, I was standing in a hallway outside party headquarters crying because I was going to have to leave the Progressive Caucus, and all of the progressive issues are very much in my heart.
How long have you been involved in disability activism in Utah?
4.5 years ago, I was standing in a hallway at party headquarters crying because I was going to have to leave the Progressive Caucus. Even though the issues are very dear to my heart, there were differences in candidate approval. So my friend Levon said, Jennifer, the Disability Caucus chair just moved out of state.
Focus on me.
And that caucus could use a little organizing. So I said, I'll go organize. So I emailed Brian King and he hooked me up with LCPD and I started going to the legislature, and I must have ran into Andrew and Donna that first year too.
And you're referring to Andrew?
Andrew Riggle. And because we're all in the same meetings. And then I went to my very first convention to officially run to be Disability Caucus chair, and Barbara showed up and ran against me.
Oh.
And I had mad respect for her incredible amount of experience, but I needed a place in caucus leadership to do the things I wanted to do, so I won. And then she invited me to DRAC. And so I was coming to DRAC at the end of the legislative session.
So that was very magnanimous of her.
I believe that the former chair had sent her.
Okay.
It got really complicated. And then I ran to be State Disability Caucus chair at that June's convention, and all my friends came and voted for me, so I won that too. And 2 years ago, I ran to be chair of the caucus chairs, so I have a position on the executive committee for the party, so I can further promote disability issues at that level.
So, what were some of your early memories of Barbara, meeting her and being invited to join DRAC?
She was so gracious and kind and generous, and it was absolutely stunning to see the difference between the Legislative Coalition, the LCPD, and DRAC.
Tell me about that.
I didn't have the best understanding for it then that I do now. I've been to some national panels. I traveled to Philadelphia for a workshop before Netroots Nation 2 years ago. In Utah, the right is very paternal, and the activism that touches the right is pretty polite to try to work with that. And then the left is even more activisty in Utah. In Utah, the Center for Independent Living, I had hardly ever even heard of them. I only knew we had one because all states have one. In other states, they are a radical political force.
Really?
Barbara was always willing to answer questions. She was enthusiastic. When she was in the hospital the last time, she was planning fundraising for her fun run.
She was, I remember that. She's absolutely...
Such a great example.
Yeah.
So I keep trying to get arrested, and I can't get arrested like she has been.
Yeah. Let's see. So as someone who's worked in this movement now, you've probably encountered a variety of different disability groups. You talked about the Utah Independent Living Center. What do you think about how those groups interact with one another? And you mentioned that there is here in Utah, there is a difference between the Utah Independent Living Center and what a lot of the national independent living centers do. Can you speak to that and how that differs from DRAC?
I think in Utah, the culture of politeness pervades the independent living centers. But I know that the new executive director of the National Centers for Independent Living is Rayma McCoy McDonald, and she has outstanding activist credentials.
Wow.
I am an alumni of the Crip Camp Zoom series we held last summer. And Rayma was one of the panelists there. I've also met her at Netroots Nation. And I don't understand. I know we all have to fit into the places we are, and I know there has been some bad feelings between LCPD and DRAC in the past, and hopefully those are starting to come together as people go to both meetings, because there's so much more we can do together.
And what do you think is the unique role that DRAC provides in disability activism?
The activism. the progressive, they open up space for everybody else to work in. It's what the far, on both sides, the far left and the far right, always open up space for the main party to move into.
Okay. Can you tell me about any specific event that's really stood out to you that you've participated in with DRAC?
Oh, can I talk about when we shut down State Street?
Please.
This was my favorite event. It was my birthday present the year that we did it. I got invited to a super secret meeting with LaPetty and Kat Kellemeyer and Sarah, and we all agreed to keep everything secret, and we were going to get arrested and to square away our bond money and lawyer phone numbers, and I had to find a place to park my kids. And it was so exciting, and Dita Seed was there too. She was doing some work for DRAC at the time. And she said, we're going to go into the federal building for a regular rally, but then we're going to sneak out to the crosswalk, and then we're going to stay there. I said, no, Dita, we have to turn around. So when the media takes our picture, the Capitol is in the background. And she thought that was brilliant, and that's what the pictures are of that day, is a bunch of crippled people and their friends holding that crosswalk on State Street for 30 or 40 minutes at lunchtime. We did not plan to stop the traffic turning left from First South, and we should have done that. There's so many lessons that day. It was so hot. I remember we did not get arrested, and I was really disappointed because this was a coordinated protest across the country, and the Capitol Police were terrible in pulling people out of their wheelchairs, and also in Pennsylvania. And even in Denver, there were people using mobility devices getting arrested and handcuffed so they couldn't use their mobility devices. And I think the Salt Lake police chief made a decision that he did not want those photos in his polite state. So they handed us water bottles and they set up some cones. The other thing I remember, and Sarah, I know you were there too, this reporter came up and talked to me and said, don't talk to me, talk to an actual disabled person, Sarah. And he kept talking to me instead of you, and I handed you the microphone and had to walk away so he wouldn't talk to me.
Yes. So that attitude again, that the media doesn't want to necessarily show disabled figures. What was the message of that rally? What was the national goal of those national...
That was the summer disabled people put their bodies actually on the ground to save Obamacare.
Did it work?
Yes, John McCain, in one of his last final acts, walked in late that night and thumbed down on the vote to turn it over. And Obamacare is the law of the land today, and we have a president who is supporting that.
Okay, what does that mean for people with disabilities?
It means everything. It means you can keep your disabled kids on your insurance till they're 26. It's got the preventative care. It's got the same 10 provisions that it had when it passed, but there's so much more important since we came so close to losing them.
Let's see. So, what did it mean?
Pre-existing conditions. That is a big thing because disability is kind of weird sometimes because you can be disabled from the moment you're conceived, or you can become disabled the first time 6 weeks before you die when you're 90 years old. And it can happen any time in between. But your average disabled person, if they change jobs, is probably going to have pre-existing conditions.
And what did that used to mean with insurance companies?
I could not see a doctor for my pre-existing condition. I could usually get my prescriptions filled, but I couldn't see a doctor in person and have the insurance company pay for it.
And VACA changed that?
Yes.
All right. So what did it mean to you personally and to your family to be involved in that struggle?
It was incredibly meaningful because I have some disabilities and I have a child with disabilities, and to know that health care was going to be available, and also for my other child, women are discriminated against in the healthcare system, but the ACA helped fix some of that. It's not completely level, but it's more level than it was.
Do you have an example of that?
I think on the preventative care, and I think they're supposed to be doing, when they test a new drug, they're supposed to study it in women and men, and in more genders than straight white men. Because a lot of our medicine is built around that, and that is not what our patient population is.
So it's not indicative that our current research doesn't necessarily take into account other races, genders.
I mean, look up heart health. We didn't even know that women had different symptoms for heart attacks. And we've had to do all this work to get into this.
Fascinating. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what it's like to work in a movement where so many members have different disabilities, sometimes dramatically different life experiences. You mentioned that you can be born with a disability or you can acquire your first disability 6 weeks before you die. What is it like to work in such a diverse population with so many different needs and so many different personalities coming together?
It has really stretched me personally, and that I always have to acknowledge that everybody else gets to speak about their own experience. And it was a really hard lesson to learn that sometimes there's no perfect 100% accommodation for a group of 10 disabled people, because by the time you get to 10, one of them is going to have an accommodation that conflicts with somebody else's accommodation. I had a group of 5 and pulled it off because I was going to film that day, and my vice chair for the caucus had a headache and wanted the room dim. And I'm like, Richard, put your sunglasses on and sit away from the light, and that is the best I can do today.
Right. So it is about meeting people where they are and not just a standard one-size-fits-all model?
Or you get a family that has multiple kids with autism but different presentation of the autism, and one kid will want absolute quiet and the other kid wants to scream a lot. And how do you balance that and give them both space to get what they need?
How do you?
I think you get some of those soundproof panels
So there
from
are
Amazon.
What I'm hearing is there are ways
and
to
you
make
put them
it.
at opposite ends of the house.
So there are ways to address conflicting accessibility needs.
Yes.
Is our society doing that?
No. All of the labor is being done by disabled people and the people who love them a lot.
So what
I mean, we can't even get airlines to do the decent thing.
Tell me about that.
We all knew that wheelchairs and other mobility devices were damaged when they were gate checked. But we didn't know what a big problem it was. And then our queen, Senator Duckworth, got a bill passed to make airlines tell us how many they damaged. And the first year of the study, it was 25 every single day.
That's a significant number.
And they don't get fixed. It takes hundreds and thousands of dollars and weeks to get wheelchairs repaired or replaced. But people who race fancy bikes, they travel with their fancy bikes, and the airlines have boxes with inflatable bubbles to put those fancy bikes in. And why don't they have boxes like that for wheelchairs?
That's a good question.
I just learned that this summer on Twitter. I learned more about disability justice on Twitter than anywhere else.
So in 1990, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that was a first step towards gaining more access. Have you seen any positive changes since that act was established?
You had really good phrasing around it being a first step, because I think a lot of people think it was the last step after the Capitol crawl.
And what was the Capitol crawl?
The legislation was stalled in Congress, and disabled people went to the Capitol and got out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the steps in some of the most dramatic scenery of civil rights movements.
What did that help accomplish?
I think it shamed Congress into passing that thing so that George H.W. Bush could sign it. It was like the demonstrations before that ACA vote.
So, do you think that we would have the protections we have if it weren't for those activists?
No.
That's what tipped the balance, you think?
Years and years of work coming out of the Crip Camp alumni with so many allies, with having an actual disabled member of Congress, Tony Coelho, who is still the chair of the DNC's Disability Caucus to this day. So many people did so much work, had so many meetings. The great sit-in in Berkeley. The Black Panthers brought meals, and when they cut the phone lines, deaf people used ASL to communicate through the windows. I mean, if you haven't seen the movie Crip Camp, just get somebody's Netflix and watch it.
And this was around the passage of 504, which secured rights for students with disabilities. Is that right?
I don't know. This is not my strong suit, and everything I know I learned from Crip Camp and Twitter. But the reason we have curb cuts that plenty of people who aren't disabled use all the time for their toddler bikes and their wagons and their strollers, that's from the ADA. The reason elevators have to work.
Can you think of other examples?
I don't think we have enough accessibility. The burden is almost always on the disabled person to figure out if that new place they want to go with their friends is going to be accessible enough. And it's one of the first things I wanted to do as Disability Caucus chair was to make sure my party events were being accessible, and I did some work around that. And it's always a challenge for a new place. I got pretty lucky one day, and some camera guy was set up on the wheelchair ramp when somebody needed to use it. So I snapped a few pictures and texted them to the mayor, who I keep in my phone, and she responds to me. And she said, "Let me have Rory look at that. Maybe we need some signage." And lo and behold, 30 days later, there were ADA buttons on automatic door openers on both doors of the council chambers. And there was a path laid out, taped out, and signs up to leave the ramp open for people who needed it, and not the media. So that was kind of cool.
So in your mind, education is an important part of extending the ADA.
Yes, but I feel like I cannot make a very small difference. I can only make very small differences, like one at a time. And if we had some more social change around this, if blueprints that went through the Planning Commission were actually approved ahead of time by an accessibility expert, if remodeling for governmental buildings, if that was run by an accessibility expert ahead of time, if web pages actually used the accessibility guidelines and that event we talked about, as soon as I saw that graphic, I knew an abled person made that graphic. Because of the monotone color and the low contrast print on it.
Can you describe the flyer itself that you're referring to?
Well, it kind of looked like a mixed drink. It was orange and yellow and maybe a little pink.
And what was the writing?
And the writing might have been white.
And why is that an accessibility issue?
There's no contrast, and the print was tiny. I mean, I have okay vision, and I could kind of read it, but I also was annoyed by this person I'd never heard of having a disability event, because I'm small-hearted that way.
Now, can you describe to me, what were things like, do you recall any examples of what access looked like before the ADA? What did society, what were the barriers you saw?
I went to a high school that had not just staircases, but it was built so long ago. It had a girls' staircase and a boys' staircase at opposite ends of the building. And if someone had to use a mobility device, they would have to go to a different school system. And that was in the early 80s, before the ADA. And lo and behold, time moves on, and 20 years later or so, there are a couple farm kids that had had bad farming accidents and used wheelchairs now. And they tore down that high school and built a new one that was all accessible. And that was amazing for a small farming community to do. And now I don't think they have any staircases, let alone a girl's staircase and a boy's staircase.
So accessibility is possible.
Yes.
Is it easy?
You know, if you do it from the beginning, it's easy. There's a school we did an event at. It was a special election, so it was an event we didn't have a lot of lead time for. And I went out to the school to make an accessibility plan. And I know that school, I didn't know when it was built, but I know they tried to make it accessible and they failed miserably. They put a ramp up in this really awkward place that there was really tight turning angles at the top and bottom. And then to get into the bathroom they said was accessible, you couldn't get in with a mobility device. There wasn't enough room. So I had to run around and move all my accessible bathroom signs to the bathrooms over by the theater. And if you are in a high school, even if it's an old high school, the most accessible bathrooms are probably going to be by the gymnasium or the theater, because outside people come into those bathrooms more often.
Do you think there is a stereotype about what kind of people are disabled? Do we think of disability as being specific to a certain age group or class, or?
I see that on Twitter, that people get told you don't look old enough to be disabled. But when you have like cerebral palsy, you're born with that. And so many invisible disabilities can happen at any age also. So I was thinking more of, because I do most of my work I do some nonpartisan work and some partisan work. In my own party, some of the other caucuses got together and said, we're not going to invite Jennifer because we want to have this event at a different place and it's not accessible. And she'll yell at us. And I get that in my own party. And screw them, I hope their event failed.
So, based on what we've just said about the changing landscape of disability advocacy, what are the important issues that are still unresolved? Where do we go?
I don't know. There's like 90% of buildings are not accessible.
90%.
I persuaded one caucus to stop holding events at a local bar because the bar I know that it's legal what they have because they're grandfathered and they're a 2-story building, not a 3-story building. But they also have a step right in front of their door with poles at the far corners, and you can't get in or out with the mobility device there either.
Is there a way to fix that?
I don't know. It's not my job to fix it. It's my job to point out to the young Dems that that building is inaccessible, and maybe they want to stop holding events there.
With changes in technology, what do you see happening with access, and how can we use technology to help further the ADA?
It doesn't just help disabled people when we have meetings online. It helps people who can't get childcare, or who have to go to work in 20 minutes, but they can go to the first 15 minutes of the meeting if it's online.
So you're saying accessibility serves the common good?
Yes, especially for statewide meetings. They should never be in person again. We ask people to drive and travel and spend money on meals and hotels to come to these meetings, and they could take them from the comfort of their own home or get together with their friends and all join in from a local site, and we could get more people involved than holding it in person. But you have to turn your captions on, and you have to have good microphone discipline, or it screws up hearing aids.
Good to know. I did want to address one issue. Earlier in the interview, you mentioned the word cripple, and I wanted to ask you about language and how it's changed. I know that there was a big push for person-first language within the disability rights community several years ago, and we are starting to see the younger generation reclaiming those more negative terms and starting to use identity-first language. Could you describe the difference in those perspectives?
When I first came to this movement, one of my friends pulled me aside, and she had been on the board with the previous chair also, and she says, "Jennifer, we use person-first language now. So say person with cerebral palsy, or person using wheelchair." And I took that to heart, and then I started reading Twitter, and it seemed like person-first language is used by able people so they don't have to say the word disabled.
Okay.
And disabled people want you to say the word disabled. And so to make everybody happy, I alternate. We're the Disability Caucus, or we're the Caucus for People with Disabilities, and I generally alternate.
So is disability a dirty word?
No. And CRIP is being reclaimed. CRIP the Vote is the best voting rights hashtag. Coined by 3 brilliant people.
Yeah. What are other hashtags that are out there right now for disability rights?
Film DIS is disability representation in media in general and films in particular.
Why is that important?
Because if we don't see ourselves, we don't know what's possible. If we don't see people like us in the media we consume, we don't know what is possible for us and people like us.
Thank you. Other hashtags?
Other hashtags. Imani Barbarin makes the best hashtags, and I have some of them on t-shirts. Ableds are weird. Kia Marie made a hashtag disabled and cute. There's a disabled and hot. There's a disability after dark. That's disabilities and sex.
Disabled people have sex?
Oh my God, yes! Sometimes they even make babies. Did you know that women who use wheelchairs can have babies, Sarah?
So speaking of women in wheelchairs, let's talk about our founder, Barbara Toomer. Do you have any other particular stories about Barbara and what kind of a leader she was?
It was really interesting going to her family had some space for us in her home. They had a little reception.
You're talking about after she passed?
Yeah, the weekend after. And it was amazing to see. She drove ambulances. She was a pinup girl before she had polio. And how she really charged into this. I mean, when she started, must have been around the time the Crip Camp alumni were shutting down that institution in New York. I mean, I think that is probably where the timelines match up. And because she already had a family, she wasn't doing that same kind of activism of that group that was at Berkeley and in San Diego and Washington, D.C. and traveling back and forth. But she was doing it here. She used to chain herself to UTA buses. That's what a lot of her arrests for. And then she traveled with National Adapt. And her grandchildren were very sweet. And I remember the chalk art on the sidewalk too.
So she was a good leader.
And I was so excited to see her chosen in the Better Days 2020 program. I didn't know it ahead of time, and I was pacing around the 4th floor the year that the display was up, and I saw a familiar face.
What is the Better Days 2020 project?
Utah has some amazingly progressive women. We had the first woman who ever voted in modern history, happened right here in Salt Lake City. The first woman state senator was elected here, and she ran against her polygamous husband and beat him in that race. We had women leadership throughout the early 1900s in through World War II. And I don't know what changed, and we lost some of that, or it seemed to diminish. We had Becky Lockhart and Olene Walker? Okay. But Better Days 2020 was an opportunity to document and reclaim that heritage of strong women leadership in Utah in honor of the 100th anniversary of women voting in the United States.
And Barbara Kimball was a part of that.
She was one of the 50 featured women.
Amazing.
And it's a great project. They also replaced, and this is a national movement, we are replacing one of our statues of a white guy with a not a white guy. And Martha Hughes Cannon, who was our first state senator, is going to Washington.
Very good. Are there any other topics around disability that we haven't touched on that you'd like to talk about?
Well, we haven't even talked about the school system, but that's a lot.
And what have you seen change there?
I would not have gotten my child through school without the help of the Utah Parent Center. And they were a fabulous ally in teaching me what to ask for my child. The school did a really lousy job telling me what my kid could have and what the rights of appeal were. They blew it a few different times. And it's kind of amazing that my child graduated with a regular diploma. I want to give a shout out to our other big ally I haven't talked about yet, the Disability Law Center, although I did get Andrew worked in. That we each have our part to play, and we can work together and accomplish things. Although some help from the federal and state governments is always welcome.
Agreed.
We haven't talked about the pandemic and disabled people.
That's true. What did you see happening in the disability community once COVID hit?
I saw disabled people dying at a higher rate in congregate care settings. I saw the access that disabled people had been begging for decades happen in the space of 10 days when abled people needed it to do their jobs. Work from home, online access, Zoom, all that burst out into wide use because abled people needed it. I saw difficulty in getting the vaccine, that high-risk groups weren't necessarily prioritized. And I know DRAC partnered with the Utah Parent Center for those vaccine clinics, And I'm really excited now that the vaccine has moved into neighborhood pharmacies and mobile sites. And maybe soon, if someone needs it, they could do home vaccinations. I know that's proposed. I know one side of the political spectrum freaked out about it. But I know one of my friends in another state, his parents are not able to leave their home, and he has a government job, and he used favors to get somebody to come to their home and vaccinate his parents. He shouldn't have had to do that.
No.
It should be an option available for people. And now we're going back into the workplace, and people are having to fight to keep their work at home options. There's some compromises about so many days a week in and so many weeks at home, but it's really challenging. And the next thing is going to be these hybrid meetings where some people will be there and some people will be somewhere else, and we're going to have to be really good on our microphone discipline.
Yeah, true. So what do you see as the responsibility of our governments, of society, in ensuring equal access for disabled people? Where do we go from here? What does the future for DRAC hold?
I know in Utah, the legislature would like to think that charities can lift most of the load. But there was recently a thing to change our education funding, and they said, oh, we'll give some of the people to disabled students, they said. They haven't done anything yet because it's only about 18 months into this process. But I really resented that they used disability as a sympathy card to take money away from public schools. It's not like public schools get enough funding. And I said, do you even know what the disability budget is like? Do you know that if you fully funded the waiting list, it could wipe out the entire education fund? Well, no, we didn't know that. How were we supposed to know that? I'm like, you can look at the budget for the Social Services Committee. I'm like, so it was obviously a political move, and they didn't really understand the mechanics around what could happen. Was that the answer to your question, or did I just rant?
No, that partially answers it. But
So I think that charity cannot carry the whole load, and some states are so paternal and misguided that some federal guidance is always welcome. But bureaucracy moves slowly.
It does.
And I don't know if we will ever get there. I've been wondering if the Starship Enterprise is even completely accessible. My son and I are watching The Next Generation, and we are late in season 6, so we are near the end.
I'm going to have to start paying attention to that.
But I know there's a novel series, When Riker is Captain, that is a fully accessible ship for a variety. In science fiction, sometimes they use aliens who grew up in different environments as a stand-in for disability. Like there's somebody from a low-grav planet or a high-grav planet, or they don't breathe oxygen, they breathe some other gas. And this ship of Rikers is fully accommodates everyone. So I think the Enterprise must not be very accessible for all alien races.
So again, it's about disability visibility.
Well, do we see disabled people in science fiction?
Are we starting to?
Now, there will be some artificial limbs because, of course, they lost it in a service accident. So there might be some of that.
What is your hope for the future of disability advocacy, and what would you like to see DRAC accomplish moving forward?
We know from the 2010 census and from the data the CDC has gathered since then that 20 to 25% of Americans have a disability of some kind at any given time. That kind of percentage changes elections and can change policy. I mean, that is a big marginalized group. if they could be organized and educated and given direction and things to do.
So empowered to vote.
Yes, and empowered to sit in their city council meetings or sit in their county council to make change at that level too. School boards. School boards are a hot ground right now for other reasons, but when all that noise happens, it pushes out actually changing policy for disabled students.
Is the election process accessible?
Well, in Utah, it is pretty accessible. Vote by mail is not a 100% solution. It's probably a 95% solution. If you don't trust your postal workers, but if you don't drive, if you were a disabled voter in Park City, you would have to go to Colville to drop off your ballot. And that decision was made by a Democrat. And now they don't hold office anymore. So, people with visual disabilities have a right to use a screen reading voting machine anywhere in the state that they want to use it. I am really nervous about disabled people off the Wasatch Front or the front and the back, southern Utah. Do all those machines work in all those counties, and does that disabled person have adequate transportation at the right hours?
You mentioned Tammy Duckworth. Why do you think it's important to have disabled elected officials?
Well, she is, not only is she a disabled elected official, she's a woman of color. She has a military injury, that's why she's disabled, is her helicopter crashed. She gave birth to 2 children, one of them while she was in office. She shows every little child in a wheelchair that she can move in the corridors of power in our country, as long as there's a ramp. I don't know how accessible that Capitol is. I know they've probably done some work and there's some accommodations, but it wasn't built for accessibility first.
No. So moving forward, you believe that should be the first step?
We have got to stop giving permits to buildings that aren't accessible.
Do you have a solution for how to do that?
That comes at planning commissions and local ordinances. I mean, look at all those buildings. We know that they tear down buildings and build new ones, because look at Sugar House. So whenever they're going to do that, they need to build an accessible building. The new building has to be accessible, and it's okay for old buildings to go away. I think we have a t-shirt along those lines that says, make it accessible or burn it down.
Well, we'll see what the future holds for us.
It's exciting with social media and the spotlight coming out of COVID. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Jennifer.